Elara, was no stranger to the cold. Not just the chill that crept through the walls of her small room on Amaryllis Lane, but the deep, bone-weary cold of living on the edge of society. By day, she was a quiet mother, trying to keep her 4-year-old son, Finn, fed and safe. By night, she was whoever her clients needed her to be, a grim necessity for Finn's survival. Her room was tiny, almost entirely taken up by a heavy, ornate wooden bed. It was the only nice thing she owned, and it was where Finn slept, tucked safely against the wall. The night the cold finally settled in for good was late in October. The air was thick with damp leaves and cheap cologne. A client, a regular she knew only as Mr. Thorne, had come calling. He was usually quiet, but tonight his eyes burned with a strange, volatile heat. Finn was fast asleep, clutching a frayed stuffed rabbit, his blanket pulled up to his chin. Elara had kissed his forehead and whispered a promise to be back soon. The argument started as a low, venomous hiss over money, but it grew quickly, escalating into a violent, shocking roar. Mr. Thorne was drunk and paranoid, filled with a sudden, self-righteous rage Elara had never seen before. He hurled insults at her, accusations that made her spirit wither. She tried to fight back, not for the money, but to keep him quiet, desperate not to wake Finn. But it was too late. The heavy silver buckle of his belt swung through the air. The struggle was short, brutal, and terrifyingly final. Panic clawed at Mr. Thorne. He glanced at the locked door, then at the small child sleeping peacefully in the bed. He couldn't risk leaving her body there. With a grunt of effort, he dragged Elara's lifeless-formed body that had been a vessel for survival and shoved it into the tight, dusty space beneath the large wooden bed. He wiped the blood from his hands on a towel, straightened his coat, and slipped back into the anonymous, indifferent city. Elara's body was hidden, but her eyes wide and fixed on the underside of the bed frame, never closed. The next morning, Finn woke up to silence, but this silence felt different. It was heavy, like the air after a storm. "Mama," he called out, his voice small and thin. She wasn't in the room. He climbed down from the bed, his small knees hitting the cold floorboards. He saw her shawl draped over a chair, her shoes near the dresser, but no Mama. He checked the tiny kitchenette, the hall closet. She was nowhere. He stood by the big bed, his eyes level with the dark space beneath it. He thought he saw a flash of her bright red scarf, a color she often wore, but it was too dark, and a strange fear kept him from looking closer. A child's mind struggles to understand absence, but it immediately understands when something is terribly wrong. Finn waited. The first day, he ate stale bread and drank water from the tap. He whispered to his stuffed rabbit, naming him Mama's Watcher. By the second day, his stomach cramped with hunger, and he started to cry, his small sobs muffled by the heavy blankets he'd crawled under. On the third day, the landlady, Mrs. Vronsky, a woman whose face seemed permanently fixed in a frown, used her spare key. The rent was late. She found Finn huddled in the bed, feverish and weak. The room smelled faintly of musk and something metallic, but Mrs. Vronsky was in a hurry. Seeing no sign of Alara, she concluded the woman had finally run off and abandoned her child, exactly what she'd always expected of those kind. Finn was taken by the authorities. When a kind but overwhelmed social worker named Clara asked where his mother was, he only pointed a small, trembling finger toward the bed and whispered, "Under it." No one believed him. They assumed the gesture was just a distressed child's way of referring to the last place he'd slept with his mother. The room was sealed, the bed remaining completely undisturbed. Finn was shuttled through the foster care system, a quiet boy with haunted, enormous eyes. He rarely spoke. His only consistent behavior was a profound, crippling fear of beds. He would sleep on the floor, in closet, anywhere but a bed. When he turned 16, he was adopted by a loving, if puzzled, couple. By then, he was Marcus, a withdrawn but gifted student. But Alara's ghost remained. Her existence was trapped in that tiny, cold pocket of space beneath the ornate wooden frame. She was bound not by the weight of the furniture, but by the devastating, unfulfilled contract of motherhood. She could not leave the room. Her world was reduced to the slivers of dust and light that crossed the floorboards. She watched other tenants come and go, a young student, an old couple, an artist. They all slept in her bed, completely oblivious to the tragedy pressed just inches beneath them. She was so cold, and her only comfort was the spectral impression of Finn's presence that lingered in the carpet fibers' fleeting, phantom warmth. She tried to reach out. Sometimes, when tenants would lie down to sleep, they'd feel a momentary icy pressure on their chests or hear a whisper that sounded like "Finn, stay." They dismissed it as drafts or just bad dreams. 40 years after her murder, an elderly Marcus Finn came back to Amaryllis Lane. He was now a successful architect, but he'd never shaken the feeling that he had left something vital behind. He had the address from his old case files. The house was being renovated, the old furniture dragged out onto the curb for disposal. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks when he saw it. The heavy, ornate wooden bed, the memory buried deeper than his mother's body, slammed into him. He felt an impulse so strong it was physical. He rushed forward and, with the surprising strength of an old man driven by a lifetime of unresolved grief, he tipped the bed frame onto its side. The wooden slats cracked. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sun, illuminating the undisturbed space underneath, and there, hidden by decades of filth and neglect, was a brittle skeletal form. The faint, tattered remnants of a red scarf were still wound around the neck bones. At that moment, 40 years of cold, lonely waiting ended. Marcus gasped, his hands flying to his mouth. The spectral cold that had held Alara in place for so long finally dissipated. Her ghost was released in a silent, heart-wrenching sigh, a breath finally taken after 4 decades. It wasn't a scream of rage, but a whisper of peace, a sound that only Marcus heard. He had found her. He had borne witness. He collapsed to his knees beside the ancient dusty bones. For the first time since he was a small boy pointing at the floor, Marcus was not afraid of what lay beneath the bed. He was finally just an adult son, quietly grieving his mother, Elara, who was finally and completely gone.